over the bow, and this poor fellow got covered with water and mud, hence the nautical terms. I have a photograph of that young man. But it was an amazing experience. In Korea, this Jewish battalion commander was so thrilled when I said I wanted to learn how to fire the tank, 90 millimeter rounds. So he took me out on the range when they were having some exercises, firing high explosives. In fact, one of the chapters, which is entitled Dying for $2, is exactly what happened that evening. I was there during the day, and just as I was about to pull the trigger on the mechanism that set off this 90 millimeter high projectile shell, the tank commander yelled, "Halt." He said, "Don't you see the Koreans running around the impact area?" They were running to get the piece of steel that landed in the impact area with explosive, because that piece of steel was worth $2. And that evening, 2 Koreans died for $2. In any case, when a chaplain came out to a field environment, and this was interesting, it doesn't look like a field environment, but when we got to certain overseas locations, the soldiers themselves would build chapels. So to announce that the Jewish chaplain was there, the Jewish chaplain's flag, which has the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, and a Magen David on top, would be placed in front of the chapel. Must tell you an interesting story apropos to the chaplain's insignia, which now has Hebrew letters as opposed to Roman numerals. One time in Korea, I was going to a division headquarters, the 1st Cavalry Division, a historic division. And as I was going to the headquarters, I got stopped by the military police. They said, "An alert has been called. By what authority are you in the division area?" So I said, "Well, look at the insignia on my cap. When you see a star on someone's cap, you don't ask foolish questions." Right? I wanted him to think that maybe I was a general, although I was quite young in those days. So he said, "But how come you're wearing captain's bars on your jacket?" I said, "Didn't I tell you not to ask foolish questions? Intelligence." And he saluted me and waved me in, and then I came back and I told him what the insignia was. Now, this looks like just a dining room with soldiers eating and conversing. And by the way, informal Jewish education in the Army was very, very important, as was formal Jewish education. But I think we accomplished far more in these informal kinds of settings. This happened to have been what was known as a retreat center in Korea, in Seoul, Korea, which was used by the various religious groups to house soldiers and to feed soldiers for various special times. We used this center for all of the major holidays, and when we used it, the kitchen was koshered out. The Army purchased about 5,000 pounds of kosher meat from New York, brought it in from New York. And how did they do that? The Army's not allowed to have separate messing facilities for religious reasons. They did it very simply. There's a master menu that's planned out months ahead of time for every dining room or mess hall in the Army. And we merely got them to substitute a kosher meat, let's say a kosher veal for a non-kosher veal, and where their menu called for pork, we managed to convince them to give us something kosher. And the kitchen, interestingly, which I have black and white photos of, was known as Mr. Moon's Kosher Kitchen, or Mr. Kim's Kosher Kitchen. I'm sorry, not Mr. Moon. I think one of the most impressive and important pictures that I ever had taken, and this I didn't know was being taken, was on an afternoon at one of these retreats, and I'd like to call them advances rather than retreats, just sitting and talking to 2 soldiers about Jewish matters. When they were there, let's say for Hanukkah, or some who were able to stay from Rosh Hashanah until Yom Kippur, we would give them crash courses in Hebrew reading and Jewish history and anything that we could possibly do. All right, this is a 3-star general, the commanding general of I Corps in Uijeongbu. You may know that name from the television series and the hit movie called MASH. Lieutenant General Harvey Fisher, a very, very tough bulldog of a general, who told me of an experience he had when he was a young commander having a Jewish soldier who was a frum fellow with a beard. And he ordered him to cut his beard during the Korean War, and the soldier refused. He said, but he was such a darn good soldier, I could do nothing about it. A real Ohev Yisrael, and again, developing these relationships with senior staff was very, very important. I'll never forget the day John Kennedy was assassinated. We got the news on a Shabbat morning, and a Korean assistant came in and woke me up very early Shabbat morning before Tefillah and said, the president's been shot. And I wasn't shocked because I assumed he was talking about the president of Korea, and that was something you expected to happen, you know, coups and counter coups. He said, but you don't understand, the president of the United States, and you have to come into the office immediately. Because when he asked me to come into the office, I said, it's Shabbat, I can't come into the office. Well, we were put on alert, and obviously I walked over to the office, and we were told that on Sunday we would have a memorial service for Kennedy. And I was asked to speak at that memorial, and I remember this general sitting there like a baby crying. When he left Korea, I lost track of him, and when I was stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia, he now was a 4-star general as the Deputy Commanding General of the Continental United States Army, all forces within the Continental United States. And he came to a review when one particular division was created as the first air mobile division with 350 aircraft. And when he got out of his car, I saluted him, and I got the biggest and the warmest greeting that I could have possibly had. So here's a man, I don't know what his background was before, but I knew that from the time that we had developed a relationship, he was going to be very supportive of Jewish soldiers. And I'll tell you a little, and these things are just popping into my mind as I talk. There was a lieutenant colonel who was a battalion commander, engineer battalion commander in the 7th Infantry Division, with a division commander who was absolutely vicious. And this colonel had young lieutenants who would make mistakes. They were young and immature. And at a briefing before his commanding general, when General Fisher was there, his commanding general berated him. And Fisher stood up for the battalion commander. And I have no doubt that one of the reasons he did so was that this Lieutenant Colonel Norm Rosen happened to have been my Jewish lay leader in the 7th Division. And by the way, that's how we did coverage in places like that, where we had troops scattered around. We tried to set up lay leaders, some of whom were very unknowledgeable of things Jewish, but who were willing to work and coordinate my visits, etc. And we trained them. This was a picture taken when General Fisher came out to our field location. We were out on a what was known as a command post exercise for a week. Obviously, I came in for Shabbat, but one of these exercises took place, or was scheduled to take place over Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and I got a hold of the G1, who was chief of personnel. I said, what are we going to do with our Jewish soldiers? They can't be out in the field on Yom Kippur. And he says, well, you're a field chaplain, conduct services in the field, which you'd have to do in combat. I said, yes, sir, I'm prepared to do that. And I said it kind of sarcastically. And by the way, I put my career on the line then because he wrote my efficiency report. I said, but this is what I need. I need special tenting to put soldiers up from the divisions. I need a mess tent with new utensils, and I need kosher food out here. So he mumbled something and must have spoken to the commanding general, Fisher, who told him, you know, I remember during the Korean War, we used to bring the Jewish soldiers back behind the lines. He says, so what we're going to do with this exercise is, unless they're of critical necessity, we're going to write them out of the problem as casualties, and all of them are going to be evacuated to Seoul for the observance of the holidays. And that's the way it was, and as far as I know, there was not even a single exception. In any case, he landed at our field site and went away from his helicopter, and I went in and had stole his helmet for a few minutes and had a photograph taken and showed it to him one day. I told him I wanted to be a general, and he didn't laugh too much about it. That was a picture I didn't know was taken. Vietnam, Saigon, Vietnam, Pesach. A most unbelievable experience. Pesach was a time when, first of all, the logistics of getting food in was very difficult. We ordered new dishes for Pesach, but what we didn't count on was that the Buddhists would start rioting, and some of you who were around during that era remember those riots. And so Erev Pesach, I got word that Pesach was being canceled. The command said that there's a curfew in Saigon, nobody's going to be permitted to come, and the rioting was going on a half a block from where we had the Siddurim scheduled. And so I called the American ambassador's office. The ambassador then was Governor Lodge, and he made an exception to policy, and the Seder went on, and those of us that left the Seder really got whiffs of tear gas. This was the period of time when the Buddhists were setting themselves on fire. Some of you may remember that. In any case, that's a picture reading a message to the Jewish soldiers in Vietnam from General William Westmoreland, who was the commanding general of forces there. And we even had some shmura matzahs courtesy of Lubavitch, which then was the Paris of the Orient. About 1 American was being killed a week then. And it turned out within 5 minutes of arrival and playing Jewish geography, I discovered that Paul Frederick's grandmother and my grandmother, Aleichem Hashalom, were first cousins. Okay, now during that era, this is something you might see in Eretz Yisrael, Chas v'Chalila. This was a movie theater that had been bombed out the week before I arrived there. This was a ship that had been taken right outside of Saigon, not unlike the Karen A. And these were some of the weapons that were found on the ship being smuggled in right through tremendous security. Now, this was my primary mode of transportation. Because in Vietnam it was not safe to go by a vehicle to most places. So you had to fly in either helicopters or fixed wing planes. And on many of these flights we fly over operations, bombed out areas, troops getting ready to go out on operations. That's actually taken from inside of a bubble helicopter, one of these three-seaters. Now, this was a typical field location where we had some fairly stable headquarters. The perimeter, which you see out in the distance with the wire, obviously is filled with all kinds of mines. You must remember that Vietnam, with its measured temperatures during the day, was probably 110 degrees, but it was probably closer to 140 degrees in the sun. And these soldiers would have to stay out there, and at night it got frightening. There was a young soldier who was on guard duty for the first time, and he kept calling the captain of the guard saying, you know, there's someone out in the perimeter line that's moving. I see some enemy. So the captain told him, fire several rounds. And he did, and a few minutes later he was back on the line, and the captain finally came out there. He took out a pistol, fired one shot. He said, I got him. And that was the end of the problem with that soldier. You'd see leaves move, or occasionally you'd have an explosion. You'd think an infiltrator was coming in. They would send an animal in to see where the mines were, and the animal would be exploded. And rarely did they have time in that kind of an environment to just put up a hammock. Prisoners that were captured in an operation. Now, this is flying over the USS Oriskany, World War II vintage aircraft carrier. The Navy had a chaplain in Vietnam assigned to the Marines, but like everywhere else, there are turf issues. And the commanding general of the Marines of that particular division would not let the Navy chaplain cover the fleet. So I volunteered to go out to this carrier, and a carrier is a big ship, but when you fly over it to land, it doesn't look so big. And when you land on it in rough seas, or in any kind of seas, you're doing a controlled crash. Because you must come in high so that if the bow of the ship comes up when you're coming in, you don't go into the ship. And you come over the deck, you set down on the deck, and as soon as you set down, the pilot gives it full power so that if you miss the cable, you get to take off. Well, the first Jew I met on this particular carrier told me an unbelievable story. He, on his first mission, took off and lost power and went into the sea. Got down to about 60 feet and managed to get out of his plane. And he was flying one of these things. I don't remember what the model of that particular fighter plane or bomber was. He said he got out without so much as a scratch. But he used to wear a Magen David, not a Magen David. He told me it was a mezuzah around his neck. And what bothered him more than the crash was the fact that the mezuzah had been ripped off by the force. Obviously, we replaced it for him. And apropos to that, the first soldier I ever visited in a hospital in Vietnam was saved by a Magen David he was wearing. He was shot, bullet, according to the medics who picked him up and found this Magen David lying beside him. Bullet was headed for his chest, was deflected by the Magen David, came out his shoulder, and he managed to survive. We were getting books of Tehillim sent to us to give out to soldiers that on one side had a piece of metal for them to place in their pockets over their hearts. Now, this was in Da Nang in the north of Vietnam, and I show you this because this was an amazing aircraft. It was a Goonie bird, a DC-3, I think also known as a Dakota. But this was unique in that it had mounted on one side 3 or 4 Gatling guns that could fire a tremendous number of rounds of ammunition. And the plane would go over a location, flying on an angle, and they would spew out fire. This aircraft was nicknamed Puff the Magic Dragon. Now, this is a posed picture. This was a picture that was taken before Yom Kippur in Vietnam in a proper chapel. The soldiers, and I'm going to read you a story in a little bit, the soldiers certainly don't look like they're wounded or in very difficult straits. They're all smiling, and they're smiling because the photographer was posing the picture. Right? News can be managed. Now, this is another picture that was posed before that day, and there's a story that I could tell you about every one of those men there, but I'm not going to tell you about everyone. Okay? The fellow on the left facing me was a Special Forces captain.